Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video, where I'm going to talk to you today about morality and politics. Politics is a subset of morality, but I'm going to talk about morality in a much more explicit sense because something extraordinary has been said today by someone who exists in the Donald Trump MAGA ecosystem as a YouTube influencer who then was given a press badge and allowed into the press corps by Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, and has even been given one of the influencer seats at the side of the press room to ask questions on occasion. So he is at the heart of the information ecosystem of MAGA, and therefore, and has been platformed by the White House, and therefore has quite a lot of, I guess, informational presence and influence. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this chap, Tim Pool, and what he said. But in order to understand what he said, we need to remind ourselves of divine command theory. So divine command theory is, as indeed this source says, a philosophical concept that posits that ethical and moral principles are grounded in the commands of God. According to this theory, an action is considered morally right if it is commanded by God, and morally wrong if it is prohibited by God. This theory asserts that morality is ultimately based on the character and will of God, making divine commands the foundation of moral obligations. Thus, actions are deemed morally required if God commands them, and morally permissible if God permits them. And you get into the whole issue of, what is something made right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? The famous issue. This is the Uifthro Dilemma or argument. Sometimes I pronounce it Uifthro, but whatever. It's a philosophical dilemma from Plato's dialogue, Uifthro. It questions the relationship between morality and religion. The argument asks whether something is right because God commands it, or if God commands it because it's right. And this is super important, because if God commands something because it's right, then morality sits outside of God, and God isn't therefore the foundation to morality. Actually, the morality exists outside of God's kind of commands. There is this somehow objective existence of morality. But if it's made good because God commands it, then it's just a kind of might is right argument, where you can't really decipher actually whether something is morally good using moral reasoning. What we would understand as moral reasoning, that's good because of X, Y, and Z. It just is that's good because God commanded it, end of. And it basically renders moral reasoning impotent. You literally can't say that that is good because of the moral reasoning, because then you're grounding the goodness of that action in moral reasoning and not in because God. So I think divine command theory is thoroughly broken as a concept. And yet it is something that many Christian philosophers or religious philosophers do defer to. Uifthro suggests that what is holy is what is agreeable to the gods, but Socrates points out that the gods often quarrel, so what is agreeable to one might not be agreeable to all. The argument has implications for modern monotheistic religions. Okay. Now, I would thoroughly contest divine command theory as being coherent and being the foundation of morality, because we all use moral there are lots of reasons why it's poor. There's still what I would call an epistemic barrier between us and God. How do we know what God is real, if there is a God, which God that is? All these competing gods with competing moral proclamations and value systems, or commands, if you like. So which God is real? But then, how do we know what God's commands actually are? Well, you read the Bible, but how do I know if I'm interpreting the Bible correctly? And that is kind of an implicit command, or is that an expectation, or is that I can interpret that in many ways? I interpret that as meaning God is commanding this, but this person interprets that as God commanding something else. So there's an epistemic barrier, kind of an epistemological barrier between us and God and God's commands. So what we then have to do, really what we end up doing, is applying our own moral reasoning anyway to the interpretation of God's revelation, right? And of course, I don't believe that God exists, and I don't believe that God commands anything anyway. But even if I did, I would still be utilizing moral reasoning on a daily basis. In fact, we all do this. Even if you do adhere to moral divine command theory, I would argue that it is a kind of post hoc rationalization, but actually functionally what you do on a daily basis. You are not going through the day going, looking at some kid punching some other kid and saying, don't do that because I think God commanded it in this, you're just like, that's morally bad. I'm using my intuition. I'm using my psychology. I'm getting a sense of what's going on here being bad. And I'm empathizing with the victim and so on and so forth. So I think we use moral reasoning functionally as a foundation to the way we go about our lives. And then for Christian people, they might add on divine command theory. And when they're talking about things in the far, sitting back in an armchair and thinking about things far more deeply, they are maybe going to the abstract and arguing to these, philosophical extremes, maybe. And it becomes more of a philosophical pastime. But essentially, divine command theory isn't how we run our lives. Okay, Tim Pool. Tim Pool said a couple of days ago, Trump literally never did anything wrong because he is the nexus of morality. This means that whether it is good is solely determined by whether Trump does it. When he does it, it is good. I've added a couple of words in there because his grammar's not particularly on point. Essentially, Tim Pool is ascribing divine command theory to Donald Trump. And he is deifying Donald Trump. I mean, this is the sign of a cult. Sign of a cult when you are turning a human being into a god, and criticism against the human being becomes blasphemy, and you are punishable by X, Y, and Z. It's treasonous, actually it's blasphemous to level criticism against such a person as Donald Trump, because they're not a person, they are a god. And there's no greater evidence of this deification of Donald Trump than seeing someone apply divine command theory to this human. Trump is the nexus of morality. What Trump does and says is good by default, by definition, because Trump is the nexus of morality. This means that whether it is good is solely determined by whether Trump does it. When he does it, it is good. There's no moral reasoning you can apply to anything that Trump does. It is just by default good because he is the nexus of morality. He is a foundation of morality. This is divine. You can, instead of God, put Trump. Divine command theory, Trump command theory, is a philosophical concept that posits that ethical and moral principles are grounded in the commands of Trump. According to this theory, an action is considered morally right if it is commanded by Trump and morally wrong if it is prohibited by Trump. This theory asserts that morality is ultimately based on the character and will of Trump, making Trump commands the foundation of moral obligations. Thus, actions are deemed morally required if Trump commands them and morally permissible if Trump permits them. Wow. This is a very dangerous place to be. If you deify a person this much, and especially if that person is already morally reprehensible, I would argue that Donald Trump is one of the least morally upstanding human beings on earth. He's terrible. He's narcissistic. I mean, like, this would make sense if it was sarcasm, right? But I don't think this is. This is Tim Pool, and I don't know whether he genuinely believes this, but he's saying it. And he has influence, and he is putting Trump at the center of morality, as a foundation of morality. a person who has cheated on his wives. He's had how many children from different women and cheated on them, and has said all these horrific things during his time on this earth. That he has, you've got the hot mic incidents of the Hollywood tapes. You've got Eugene Carroll and the court cases that have found him liable for sexual abuse, so on and so forth. And you're like, this is the guy that you are saying is the nexus of morality. That's extraordinary, but it's also completely philosophically redundant. I mean, it suffers from all this claim of Tim Pool, suffers from all the problems that divine command theory does. And, you know, if you want to find out about that, you can read my book, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist. So here it is. How to do knowledge, meaning and morality in a godless world. And that will tell you how divine command theory just doesn't work. And if you want to have a little insight into this epistemic barrier, I even have some nice pictures at the back of the book talking about the epistemic barrier that exists between us and any form of objective morality you think might exist. You still have to interpret that. How do you know that your sense of the objective morality is correct compared to anyone else's? So we still have to go through this subjective process. So in other words, morality is functionally subjective anyway. Now, what we want to do is universalize that subjectivity so we can all come to a consensus using moral reasoning and rationality and philosophy to agree on our moral kind of precepts and come to a consensus. And that's functionally what we do. And we agree societal, social rules and norms and mores. And then we elect politicians who try and represent that, and then we get judges in place that try and represent our sense of morality to then enact moral laws that reflect our consensus, and then we have law enforcement to enforce those moral laws. So we build this up socially, but we know it's subjective because you go to a different country and they will have different laws, different voting ages, different sexual consent ages, different drinking ages, and you know, these things differ around the world because people come to different consensuses. But in whatever country you exist in, your country has come to a consensus that exists. Now, you might disagree with that and laws change. And actually, we challenge laws and we say, actually, I'm not too sure about that, or we need to change it a little bit. And we go through this process of philosophical evaluation of our laws, but they don't exist out there. And even if they do exist out there, we are always having to interpret them anyway, using our moral reasoning, our sense of rationality. So this divine or Trump command theory is just a broken concept anyway. Let me know what you think. Have at it in the comments. It's been a long time since I've done one of these videos. Take care and I'll speak soon.